1972. I was involved in a strike down in Imperial Valley, California. It was on the border with Mexico, across from Mexicali. And there was an injunction that was put down. The court enjoined us from picketing. They were going to allow us one picket every 500 yards or something, so we could see any of the pickets out at the fields. And so we decided we had to violate the injunction, so I wound up in jail. And of course, so they, it was on a Friday, yeah, naturally. You know, they wouldn't give me anything to read but what? The Bible. That's right. They were going to save my soul. That was it. So for the first time as an adult, I read Exodus, and it just blew me away because it was like reading a handbook on organizing.
Moses was called by God, heard the Lord's voice there, and I was also struck by just his feelings of inadequacy. I mean, over and over, like by like chapter 6 is like, come on, Moses, like he kept complaining, I don't have the words, I can't do it, and all this stuff, and God had to reassure him that, you know, God would give him the words or would use Aaron to speak for him. And so,
what do you think the point of that is with respect to organizing? The point of all that reticence and back and forth?
Oh, well, I think that maybe that we're never, if we wait to be prepared, and we wait until we're fully equipped and we feel ready, then we'll never start because, you know, we all have things to work on, and it's like, I've heard the saying before, like God equips the called, God equips the called, he doesn't call the equipped.
Where did Moses grow up?
In
the palace, right? That's kind of interesting. So this guy, he's a Jew who's an Egyptian. He's an insider, right? In the sense that he's identified with the oppressed. But where did he grow up? Gee, he grew up in the house of wealth. He grew up with resources, with access to resources, the oppressor. Does that sound familiar at all? In where organizers come from and social movements and kind of how they work, insider, outsiders. I mean, Dr. King we can think of as being an insider, but, you know, what was Dr. King's background? I mean, aristocratic African-American family, major church in Atlanta, got his PhD at Boston University. I mean, that's about as outsider as you could get to somebody working in the Mississippi Delta. So, I mean, there's something about insider, outsider. There's something about identification with the oppressed and access to resources of the oppressor that seems to reverberate through the history of social movements of all kinds. They're not like signing up to support it. He scares the hell out of them. I mean, it's like, hey, we got to live with this. You know, who appointed you? Who gave you this job to come in here and speak for us? And, you know, we got to live with these people. You ever encounter that kind of a reaction in organizing? Boy, you sure do. I mean, it's kind of, you know, people have made accommodation with circumstances that are not just circumstances, but we have to survive. We make accommodations. Along comes somebody, you know, agitating and organizing, and often the first reaction is fear directed in the form of anger toward the person who's trying to point out the contradictions in their circumstances. There's a crucial moment when it becomes clear they're ready to go. Yeah?
I think when you achieve changes in people behavior.
Yeah. Well, what's the change in behavior? What's the evidence? In the story, there's a specific moment in which there is a change of behavior that sends the signal that they're ready to go. Yeah?
Well, they have the first class over. I mean, they prepare, they make themselves ready, and they even paint a sign on their door saying, we are the ones
exactly.
who will go.
And they paint, it's not just a sign. What are they painting on their door? It's blood of a sacrificial lamb. So it's like a heavy-duty kind of deal, you know. It's not like red paint. But what's the significance of that? What's the significance of that? You just sort of said, yeah. They're declaring themselves. They're saying, yes, here we are. I am one of these. And I'm declaring myself publicly. And it's as if God is waiting for that to happen before they're actually ready to go. And it seems like a lot of this back and forth is all about preparing the people. It's kind of based on the idea you can't give people freedom. People have to take freedom. They have to be ready to act. And it seems like that whole period there is to move the people into a readiness to action, both by trying to reduce the fear, by trying to demonstrate more hope, and then finally that point is achieved, and then of course they go. We were once organizing a mushroom plant in California, Stakemate Mushrooms. Had about 300 workers in it near Morgan Hill, and most had no papers, mostly undocumented workers there. And so it was tough, you know, a lot of fear, a whole lot of fear in the place. And so we worked very hard with the organizers. We got about 60% of the people to a meeting, which took a lot of intense effort. And in this meeting, of course, people then began to articulate their grievances. So people are voicing their complaints in public, and that's important because they recognize it's not just individuals, it's everybody. But you know, there was this big problem there of fear. So at this point, one person stood up and said, I move that we not be afraid. I said, oh, that sounds interesting. That's an interesting idea. I said, okay, is there a second? Yeah, I second it. Okay, well, that's pretty cool. All right, everybody who's in favor of being afraid, please raise your hand. Everybody who's in favor of not being afraid, raise your hand. Oh, yeah, well, everybody's, right? Say, okay, great, so now it's been decided we're not afraid. So now what do we do? Well, we just so happens we have these bags of buttons over here. And so what we'll do to demonstrate this decision we just made is that everybody will go to work the next day wearing a union button. Everyone, all together. Okay? Next morning, we had organizers at the gates, of course, to make sure, just in case somebody forgot their button at home. The buttons were there. The next day, about 70% of the people had on union buttons in this place. And it just changed the atmosphere. I mean, the foreman's power, which was based on fear and intimidation, was evaporated. Now, it was still a struggle. We eventually won the election, but that day was a turning point because it sort of killed the fear. And it was based on public declaration. And that's really what the people are asked to do here. They're asked to declare themselves collectively and publicly, we are of this, we are ready, and so then they go. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of the Reformation. I mean, because it was a taking back of the right to govern the church by what we call the people of God. It's sort of divesting the hierarchy and saying, okay, we have the right to do this. Now, it was all argued in a church context, but if you go forward, if you go to 17th century England, when the Puritan Revolution occurred there, and they had all these debates about church governance, about, you know, what was appropriate, who could participate, who couldn't, how, the rules of elections and so forth. It was called the Putney debates. It was part of Cromwell's army. And you look for the source of arguments about how to organize American government, where do you find, that's where they started. And you see them lifted directly from these arguments about church governance into governance of constitutional state governance. So this whole idea of self-governing constitutions really is an evolution of an enactment of what they understood the covenant to be between God and people and the role of self-governance. So Reformation, very, very important thread. Who said the French Revolution? Yeah, French Revolution, another very important thread. Which thread did it pick up? They saw themselves as a continuation of that Greek-Roman tradition of self-governance. And so that's another current. It's kind of like what we think of as a civic tradition. Captain Boycott was a British landlord, and he owned land in Ireland. And his tenants got together because the conditions were so lousy and refused to pay rent. And that became known, oh, well, they're refusing to pay rent to Captain Boycott. And then that just became known as a boycott, where you refused. And so that's kind of how it entered the popular language. But I point that out to say there's a third source. You know, there's a religious source, there's a civic source, and there's a popular source of just people finding tools of self-help in order to assert their interests. I'm drawing on these examples to suggest not that these are the only sources, because different cultures have different sources, but it's important to look back for the ground, both the moral ground and the political ground, for the kind of work that you do and sort of what it fits into.
No one pays attention to the patriot radicals because they have crazy ideas, and but the group who are upset about the import taxes don't seem to have enough oomph behind them to change anything.
It's nice.
So then it seems to be a couple of like key town meetings where 5,000 people show up, so everyone sees it's not just me who has a problem with this. Everyone in the area has a problem with this.
Yeah. Don't buy the tea, then you're denying the government the tax revenue directly, right? Plus, what else are you doing? Yeah.
I think you're getting the merchants on your side, the tea merchants on your side.
Which ones, the local ones or the British?
No, the ones selling the tea. The
You're getting them on your side?
Yeah, you're keeping, maybe I'm wrong about this.
No, go.
You're keeping them from selling what they want to sell. You're hurting them financially. It's kind of like the bus strike.
Yeah, in order to get them to do what?
To also lobby the government.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a dual strategy. It denies tax revenue to the government, and it leverages the economic influence of the merchants and the tea merchants on the government as well. It's strategic, and it's conceived as a way of leveraging economic power.
It's really symbolic in the sense that everyone drinks it, and it's a small thing. It's not like lumber that would be really hard to boycott, and it would be really detrimental.
You say, where did the people come from? That's a good question. In all three cases, where did the people come from? Where did all those people come from in Gandhi? Anybody know? They just appeared at the seashore, or Gandhi just got up and said, I'm a man, you're going to do what I do. Where'd they come from? Anybody know? Yeah, Ann?
Well, there was a deliberate march across the country, and there was an element of showmanship, the author said, and the fact that it was made very public and presentable so everyone could see it and everyone was able to then access it. In
the case of King, where did all the people come from? Yeah. See, in other words, it's interesting. In each of these cases, another commonality of them is that each was rooted in a religious tradition. Whether Hindu tradition, Catholic, or Black Protestant, which meant that there was kind of a moral community. There were institutions that connected to large numbers of people, not just in intelligentsia, right? So they were connected with institutions out there through which they could reach more and more people. I think it's useful just not to think of these as each just like a separate thing, but rather sort of an ongoing effort for people to find ways to hold power accountable, to make their values count by turning it into economic or political power, and to do so with intentionality and strategically. When you get right down to it, the methods, the techniques, the processes are not that different. It's not just about the world as it is, and it's also not just about the world as it ought to be, but it's an effort to couple those two in a vision of the world as it can be and move toward that vision.